Once upon a time, when fascism was just a weird Italian artistic movement and the Italian people were furious at the size of their borders after a world war, a new city-state was born on the shores of the Adriatic. In the city now called Rijeka, the Italian irredentists, under the leadership of Gabriele D'Annunzio, seized control of the city and established their own society. For the next year and a bit, they governed themselves under the leadership of the man they called Il Duce. Despite the brief time these men were in power, they would inspire Mussolini's march on Rome and establish the first fascist society in Europe. This is the story of the Regency of Carnaro. The city of Fiume, now Rijeka in Croatia, was a point of contention between the Italian and early Yugoslavian state, then called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes. Prior to the First World War, the city had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but with the collapse of the empire and the establishment of a new Yugoslav state, there was disagreement over what was to happen to the port. Due to the Italians making up the largest single ethnic group and almost 50% of the population, and promises made by the Allies when Italy joined the war, the Italian government believed Fiume should become part of Italy, while the Yugoslavs wanted control over the port as it was the most important one in the region at the time. The Allied Peace Conference was able to reach an agreement between the Italian government and the Yugoslavians. Fiume would come under a League of Nations mandate. The government was to be led by a commission of 5 members named by the League of Nations. 2 Italians, 1 citizen of Fiume, 1 Yugoslav, and 1 from another League of Nations power. It was to be a free port with no military and no taxes except local ones. A plebiscite would be held in 15 years, deciding whether to remain independent or join Italy or the new Yugoslav state. The minutes of the US State Department rather optimistically show that they predicted Fiume would choose independence. The Allies were mostly happy with this arrangement. The Italians were very unhappy with this arrangement, and the idea of a mutilated victory came to dominate Italian political thought. And many political groups, particularly those with veterans of the Great War, took it upon themselves to expand Italy's borders on their own. And it's here we're introduced to an interesting fellow called Gabriele D'Annunzio. Some of you might have heard of him, though probably not for leading a fascist militia in an invasion. D'Annunzio was celebrated across Italy at the time for his work in film and literature. He had written 7 novels as well as many more poems, short stories and plays. He also wrote the movie Cabiria, which Martin Scorsese called the first epic in film, and Roger Ebert described as having limitless scope and ambition. He was also a strident nationalist and had joined the Italian military during the First World War, becoming one of their first fighter pilots. In a typical show of extravagance, in 1918 he led a squadron of planes right over Vienna in order to drop propaganda leaflets he'd written. Basically, he's quite a character and was immensely popular among the Italians. D'Annunzio got to work organizing the nationalists around himself, and on the 12th of September 1919, D'Annunzio led a group of around 2,000 veterans on a march from Italy to the contested city. For the next year and a half, Fiume would stand as an independent city-state, run by a bunch of people who frankly had no business in government, supported economically by modern-day pirates who raided cargo ships for food. And D'Annunzio really did just march into Fiume. There was an Allied occupation force in the city at the time, but rather than risk an incident with Italy, they chose to withdraw, leaving the Italian radicals in charge. In triumph, D'Annunzio announced that the city was now Italian territory, and probably believed that he'd just pulled the greatest move of his career. The Italian government, however, felt differently. They not only refused to take control of the city, they ordered their own military to begin a blockade. The movement was too popular to openly fight, so the Italians intended to start them out. D'Annunzio's popularity only seemed to increase, however. On the 20th, a group of pilots flew from an Italian airfield to Fiume to place themselves at D'Annunzio's command. A brigade of troops from Lombardy also tried to defect, but they were turned away simply due to a lack of food. One passenger steamer of around 5,000 people tried to make it to Fiume to defect, but they were caught and turned back before they arrived. By September, it was estimated that D'Annunzio had around 9,000 armed men at his command, as well as planes. Sympathizers in the Italian military meant that the blockade of the city was lax in the extreme, and small amounts of food continued to trickle in, allowing them to sustain themselves. By December, the Italian government was desperate to prevent a diplomatic incident, and offered the people of Fiume a deal. The Italians promised that they would prevent the city from being annexed to Yugoslavia in the future, and would endeavour to annex the city themselves. D'Annunzio held a plebiscite among the people of Fiume to find out how much support there was for a deal. When this passed overwhelmingly, he declared the results invalid and that he would make the final decision. Naturally, he then said no. Now you might be wondering why that was, given that he was trying to get the city into Italy in the first place, and this deal would have been a powerful step in the right direction. Well, it appears that he distrusted the Italian government because they'd refused to annex the city immediately after he'd taken control of it. But there's a second factor. Gabriele was a peculiar man, and based on what came next, he probably just liked being in charge. In a grand speech, he declared that Italy is with me, with us, the true eternal Italy. The enemy is around Fiume, which I will defend to the last breath with every means. Here is truth. Falsehood is around us. He declared himself Il Duce, a title Mussolini would later adopt when he became dictator of Italy. And so it was that this bizarre man became the world's first fascist dictator. He began organizing massive parades of his soldiers, and they used the Roman salute to praise their leader. You may recognize this salute from a certain other country that would later adopt it, having been inspired by Fiume. Though D'Annunzio was relying on a core group of paramilitary war veterans for power, Fiume itself became a beacon for radicals from all across Europe. Bolsheviks, fascists, and artists gathered in the city, believing that they could be a new model for the world. Lenin himself proclaimed that he and D'Annunzio were the only true revolutionaries in Europe. One of those attracted to the city was Alceste de Ambris, a prominent Italian syndicalist, which is basically a form of socialism that was popular in the period. He quickly rose through the ranks of the new Fiume government and found himself a member of D'Annunzio's cabinet. Unfortunately, cracks began showing in the new city pretty quickly, as the radicals discovered that being radical doesn't necessarily mean you agree with one another. In the case of the socialists, for example, condemning every other slightly different form of socialism is an essential part of being socialist. Factions formed among the many different groups, and though Fiume stayed stable-ish, it was pretty clear that they needed a more secure government than D'Annunzio making proclamations. D'Annunzio came to rely on a group of artists, anarchists, and ex-Italian soldiers who formed the Union of Free Spirits tending towards perfection. They liked Hinduism, nudism, and agrarianism. They were also on drugs. A lot of drugs. Because there was no control over cocaine at the time, many of the soldiers had become addicted while in the army, and the idea that maybe being high all the time was detrimental wasn't that widespread. They were kind of fascist hippies led by a poet. With the Italian blockade continuing, the government began organizing pirate raids using the warships that had been docked in the harbour when D'Annunzio arrived. Small groups of soldiers also began raiding the countryside to steal horses, weapons, and food from the garrisons. These raided supplies were used to fund a near-constant festival that went on in the streets, and fabrics were stolen to dress the city's soldiers and leaders in increasingly elaborate uniforms. The constant party sounds fun on paper, but you can't run a country on party. Believe me, they tried, but you really do need adults in the room, otherwise things fall apart pretty quickly. Food and medicine began running low, and the economy of the city collapsed. Children were sent into Italy to ensure their safety and save supplies. The Belgian poet Leon Kochnitsky that had accompanied D'Annunzio described the scene. One's gaze, wherever it fixed, saw a dance, of lanterns, of sparks, of stars, starving, in ruin, in anguish. Perhaps on the verge of death in the flames or under a hail of grenades, Fiume, brandishing a torch, danced before the sea. On the 8th of September 1920, D'Annunzio completed what he probably considered his masterwork, the Charter of Carnaro, and officially established the city as the Italian Regency of Carnaro. The new constitution was a revolutionary document that divided the city into 10 different corporations, modelled after labour unions. Each of these corporate groups would be represented in the Council of Corporations, led by Gabriele D'Annunzio himself. The groups were factory workers and farmers, fishermen, business owners, white-collar workers, teachers, lawyers and doctors, civil servants, and cooperative workers. You may have noticed that this is only 9 groups, and that's because D'Annunzio reserved a special 10th group for those in society he deemed superior, which in his case was mostly artists. Additionally, there was a Council of the Best, elected by universal suffrage with 1 representative per 1,000 citizens. It was not only revolutionary politically, but D'Annunzio insisted on it also being a work of art. The constitution contained the 3 central tenets of Fiume. Life is beautiful and worthy of being severely and magnificently lived by a man rebuilt entirely by freedom. The complete man is one who knows how to exercise every day his own virtue to offer every day his brothers a new gift. Work, even the humblest, even the most obscure, if well done, tends to beauty and ornates the world. The new state also declared that music was the highest of all the city's arts, and from their first day of school children must be taught choral singing founded on the basis of the most naive peasant poetry. It established a free university with a school of fine art, a school of decorative arts, and a school of music. It established a government office of aldermen, made of men of pure taste, exquisite skill, and of newest education. These men were tasked with decorating the city and imbuing the population with an appreciation for the arts. The constitution closed with these lines: choral and instrumental bodies subsidized by the state are instituted in all the communes of the Regency. The College of Aldermen is entrusted with the task of building a rotunda capable of holding at least 10,000 listeners, with comfortable seats for the people and a vast pit for the orchestra and choir. Large choral and orchestral performances are totally free. as the Church Fathers said of God's graces. The end of the Regency would come just 3 months after the signing of the Constitution. Negotiations between the Italians and Yugoslavians had borne fruit. The Treaty of Rapallo was signed between the two countries, establishing Fiume as an independent city-state. With no more risk of a diplomatic incident, the Italians were finally ready to remove D'Annunzio from his city. On Christmas Eve, the Italian army attacked the city in an event now known as Bloody Christmas. The weary soldiers of Fiume were unable to put up much resistance, but D'Annunzio turned his palace into a fortress. The Italian fleet was eventually ordered to bomb D'Annunzio's palace, and only it. It will be enough. D'Annunzio will be so surprised that he will escape at once. The palace was bombed, and on the 30th of December 1920, he surrendered the city to the Italians. Around 60 people had died in the fighting, with hundreds more being injured. So what became of D'Annunzio? Well, he was let off pretty easily, actually. Mussolini had been inspired by him and took power in Italy shortly afterwards, so he gave D'Annunzio a luxurious estate in the north, and he spent the rest of his life there. He became a sort of leader in the fascist movement, but only sort of. His early work was too revolutionary to obtain much political power, and Mussolini considered him a threat to his rule. For the most part he was honoured, but kept secluded, until his death in 1938. He was quietly acknowledged as an important figure in fascism, while everyone tacitly recognised that he was outdated. Fiume itself would be an independent city under a local council for another 4 years, before Italy simply annexed it, as D'Annunzio had wanted all along. Much of the ceremony and imagery of fascism can be traced back to Fiume. The marches and black uniforms and street violence, and the Roman salute and grand speeches were all innovations from D'Annunzio. It's not a huge surprise, really. He was a celebrity. He knew how to move crowds. Though it was a fairly inauspicious start, and the later fascist regimes despised the sort of anarchism that D'Annunzio practiced, it was still the start of fascism as we know it, albeit in a strange embryo form. Fiume also marks the early connection between fascism and communism. I would like to emphasize emphatically that I'm not saying the fascist regimes of the 30s and 40s were communist. They weren't, nor were they socialist. But it is important to recognize that fascism wasn't a means of upholding the status quo. It was an inherently revolutionary ideology that wanted to overthrow the old order and establish a new one. In the very early days of fascism, this meant that the borders between communist and fascist thought weren't as clear, as the details of both groups are still being worked out. However, once these diverse revolutionary groups had gathered in Fiume, the differences arose pretty quickly, with factions emerging. It also marks a strange area of art in which progressive artists combined with radical nationalists to form a new sort of politics. So there you go. That's the story of the Italian Regency of Carnaro. Bit of a weird one.